Hello, and welcome to another episode of Fractional Futures, where in this season, we're exploring how fractional CMOs can help SMEs and portfolio companies accelerate growth and maximize enterprise value. In this episode, we're diving into a crucial aspect of scaling any type of business, and that's customer acquisition and retention. Now, acquiring customers is essential, but keeping them is what drives long-term profitability and sustainable growth. So today we're going to be exploring how businesses can craft a compelling value proposition to stand out in the market, how they can optimize their acquisition channels for maximum ROI, and how to build retention strategies that increase lifetime value and reduce churn. Joining me today is Rob Nicholls, a strategic CFO, a non-executive director and board advisor with over 35 years of global finance experience. Rob also specializes in profit maximization and value creation. Hi, Rob. Welcome to the show.
See you again, Paul.
What have you been up to since we recorded the last episode? You've been thrashing out on the golf courses?
You know, the weather's been against me, Paul. The weather's been against me. In fact, it was yesterday as well. So hopefully later this week, but a bit of vacation, bit of art, bit of culture as well, which is good. And we're back to it now.
So, Rob, let's dive into the first topic. I want to look at how to craft an effective value proposition. We both know if you, as a business, if you can't clearly articulate why your business matters, you're going to struggle to acquire and retain customers. So I want to explore why defining a strong value proposition is essential and how to prove traction can validate that you found the right product market fit. So, Rob, with your CFO hat on from a financial standpoint, how do you assess whether a company's value proposition is effectively driving revenue, and what role should finance play in shaping it?
So I'm glad you wanted to talk about this because this is, I think, a critical area for businesses. It's not talked about nearly enough. And I work with a lot of startups that have been awarded Innovate UK grants. And value proposition is one of the first things we start with. We do training classes on this, such that startups, early and often pre-revenue startups, get a good handle on what their value proposition, who they're targeting, what they're offering, what their product or service is, and what the deliverables are to the client. And if I go and switch that thinking to the SMEs that I work with, the value proposition really oftentimes is not clear, it's not thought about, and oftentimes there's a marketing person involved in the business or a business development stroke marketing person, but they don't really get what the value proposition is. So I think it's critically important, and there is a role to play for the CFO because, again, in a lot of startups and a lot of SMEs, less than 50 people, you'll have a senior finance executive. You probably should have a fairly senior marketing executive. And there is a role to play here because finance are driven by numbers. So whether it's revenue, profitability, margin, pricing, whatever it is, there is input that is going to be given by the CEO and the CFO to marketing to focus on what is the value proposition that's going to drive the metrics that are important to the business. And generally, that's going to be revenue-oriented, margin-oriented, pricing and profitability, those sort of variables. And then the output from that is the value that we're creating with the business. And I don't think it's talked about nearly enough. I don't think it's really understood by an awful lot of CEOs. It's interesting on the social media channels now, a lot of people are talking about on your headline, you need to be very clear about what your value proposition as a business leader is to your client. And it's the same thing. It's understanding what the output is, what you're creating for your clients. And it's the same way with the value proposition in the business. You need to be crystal clear on it. And it may evolve and pivot over time as you get traction in the marketplace and you establish product market fit. But it's not nearly well understood. And I think it comes back to the marketing leader or whoever is running that part of the business to be clear on it and to make sure everyone in the organization, including finance, is clear on it. And it's something we've moved away from to an extent, I think.
I think you're absolutely right, and certainly some of the investors I speak to, that they expect a documented value proposition that outlines the unique benefits. And when we talk about benefits, we're not talking about product features or service features. We're talking about functional value that someone receives from a product or a service. But it's not just about the functional value, also, Robert. It's about the emotional value. And I think, particularly in B2B services marketing, if you're a decision maker in a company, you've got to find an outsourced partner to do something. There's a commercial risk that you face because you've got to make a decision on a partner, and you're going to be worried about, are they the right organization to provide the service or the products? Is it going to be the right quality? Is it going to be on time? Is there any other risks attached to that? Now, as that decision maker, if you get that decision wrong, there's some professional advancement jeopardy that might come your way. It might impact your career. And so part of that value proposition also needs to look at, who is the buyer? Who is the decision maker? What problems have they got? And how is your product or service going to solve those? The value proposition isn't just about differentiation, but it's also about clarity. It's about relevance. And it's also about proof of demand. And I think certainly from my perspective, from a marketing leadership role, the CMO's role, or the marketing director's role, they've got to prove to the CFO or the investor that the value proposition is driving traction. And I think traction is the ultimate validation that a business has found its product market fit. So metrics like customer acquisition rates, repeat purchases, referral growth, that's what's going to prove to someone like you, a CFO or an investor, that there is resonance there. That the value proposition does resonate with the market.
And that is really, really important to an investor. And if it's important to an investor, it's very important to the CFO. And the key word here is traction. And traction generally is going to be clients on a wait list, perhaps when they're pre-revenue, clients who are onboarded maybe on a freemium version of a product. But it's validation through traction and revenue generation. And if you can see that revenue generation, I talk a lot about other businesses, and I was looking at one business in the US last night. They had 70% increase in revenue quarter over quarter. That's phenomenal. And that's a business that's, a multi-billion-dollar business. And that's the sort of revenue traction you need to be seeing, because if that is the case, that's validation that the value proposition is clearly aligned with what customers want. And I think that's really, really critical. And I often compare and contrast the UK against the US. And the value proposition is something that's very clearly defined in the US. It's a point that investors focus in on really, really quickly. Even if it's pre-revenue, are they crystal clear on who they're serving, what they're offering, what the output is? And to your earlier point about differentiation, I'm not so worried about differentiation. There can be 4 providers in a marketplace providing very, very, very similar products or services. 1 or 2 of those is going to get validation through rapid growth, rapid traction in the marketplace, even if they're offering the same product. There are thousands of people on the social media offering the same product. Some of them are just doing it way, way better, communicating what they're doing for clients better, and they're getting traction, and therefore then they're getting revenue as well.
Yeah, I'll totally agree with that. And a couple of my clients, they've really struggled with the value proposition. They've been doing what they've been doing for years and years and years, and people kind of know what category they're in. But there's other competitors doing a better job. And so doing a workshop with the leadership team, saying, like, let's talk about value. People do struggle with what value is. They automatically think of features. And it's really, where do you add value to your clients or your customers? You're going to help them execute something better. You're going to help them save time. You're going to help them do something cheaper or faster or better. People don't buy a car because it's got 4 wheels and a gear stick. They buy a car because they want to get from A to B. And I think a lot of business leaders need to think differently, use a different mindset about the value that they actually offer, not the things they do.
It really isn't rocket science, is it, at the end of the day? And I'm surprised in this day and age that businesses still struggle with orienting marketing actions, communications around the product benefits, the service benefits. And it's really all about outcomes. It's what can your product or service do for me to improve my business, to make it work better, faster, for me to increase sales, revenue, profitability. That's what it's about. It's about outcomes, not features and benefits. And it's a little surprising that in this day and age, we're having to not so much re-educate, but re-familiarize business about some fairly basic concepts that we've moved away from. And to a large extent, this is marketing's role, is to educate the organization about what is important in the marketplace, not just where's the market going, what the customers want today, but what the customers want tomorrow in terms of their outputs. What are they willing to pay? What pricing are they willing to pay? I think we've lost an awful lot of that as well.
Yeah, no, totally echo all of that. I'd like to, I guess, move on. I guess slightly following on from that, I want to look at optimizing customer acquisition channels. So I think there's one thing having product market fit and having a strong, a well-defined value proposition. I think one of the other things we need to do is really optimize the channels that we're acquiring customers from. Customer acquisition is essential for growth, but it needs to be efficient, it needs to be scalable, and it has to be aligned with some form of ROI goal. So what I want to do now, Rob, is break down how to maximize performance across paid, organic, and partnership channels without wasting budget on low impact tactics. So Rob, from your standpoint, when you evaluate marketing spend, how do you determine the optimal balance between short-term customer acquisition costs and long-term profitability? And what metrics do you prioritize?
So this is an area that I find fascinating, to be honest, that no business gets right. I'm a big believer, if you've got $1 million worth of sales, you should be spending 10% of that revenue number on investment in brand, marketing, tactical, or strategic activities. And if you're not spending 10%, you're underinvesting, and therefore, over time, the growth in revenue is just going to tail off and you're going to wither and die if you. So I'm a big believer in, you've got to generate revenue, you've got to have a line that says marketing, PR, promotion, communication, whatever that is a decent line. I see a lot of businesses that invest nowhere near enough money. They're turning over 2, 3, 5 million pounds a year, but they're spending a couple of £1,000 a year on marketing, outside of perhaps one person doing some BD or some sales or some marketing activity. But I think the easiest way for a lot of businesses and the lowest cost way, and I'm a big believer, is strategic alliances and partnerships. And I think it's something that's done not nearly enough in the UK. Again, it's very, very widely utilized in the US. And I don't understand really why we don't do it more here. I think perhaps trust is part of it. People don't know a lot of other people outside of their specific industry or their business. If they got out there more often, I put in place a couple of years ago a partnership with one of my clients with an insurer, and basically enabled that insurer to sell product on the back of my client's product. But if my client's product was sold into the channel, the buyer would receive a 10 to 15% reduction in their insurance premium. So it was a clear win-win. And we boasted revenue probably 20% just on that strategic alliance. There was no investment. There was no investment by the insurer in my client. It was a win-win. And I don't think we do that nearly enough. It's relatively low cost. Yes, there's some engagement has to be had. We don't do it nearly enough. And I think businesses, should be doing a great deal more of that. They should have 3 to 4 partnerships in different channels for different clients. The client I was working with was specifically in one industry. It was actually agriculture. But they just focused on that one industry. And you could parlay 3 or 4 good relationships in that industry. And then on top of that, they built organic spending. They did some SEO, they did blogs, they did some social media, and they didn't have a marketing person in place. We just did it, the CEO, myself, and an outsourced freelance copywriter. So there's an awful lot you can do. But I come back to the previous premise, is that you need to be investing. And we haven't really talked about brand yet. A brand, you can have a brand at £1 million turnover a year as you can at £1 billion turnover business. And I really don't think SMEs in the UK think enough about the brand in the marketplace. They may do a rebranding and change the name. They may change the font or the colouring on their wording. That's really not branding. That's just imagery in my world, if you will. But I talked to a recruiter a couple of weeks ago, and she's doing a rebranding right now. And effectively, it's really just changing the name of the company. Well, it's part. I asked her, well, have you gone to an outsourced agency, a strategic, a marketing firm, if you will? She said, oh no, we've done it ourselves. It's like, well, that's not really investment in your brand. It would have been smart to outsource it, get a kick-ass marketing person in there to develop the whole remit of strategic deliverables, understanding their value proposition, who the customer is, where the market is, what the marketplace thinks of your brand at the moment. People seem very reluctant to invest in that currently, and I think that's something that I, as a CFO, strongly support, because I know 6 months down the line, we're probably going to have an inflection point in terms of revenue generation or client numbers or onboarding or an improvement in retention or an improvement in client conversion.
I'm really glad you mentioned that 10% number. So, and I know that there's a lot of marketers that often have a bit of headbutting with the CFO to ask for more money. Certainly, in my background, my career, I've spent a lot of time in professional services, and there's a lot of organisations I've been in where the total marketing spend is about less than 1% of total revenue. And I always say, and there's lots of written, academic words out there around this 10% rule of thumb. If you're not allocating,
I just came up with that myself.
No,
Maybe that's where I got it from.
It is a general rule of thumb. Yeah, it's a general rule of thumb, and I think as a business, and if there's any business leaders listening or watching this episode, if you're not allocating 10% of revenue, you're not ambitious enough in your growth journey. Full stop. I think that's fair to say. And if you've not got that level of revenue to invest, you're doing something wrong. You're probably wasting effort. You're wasting resources in other parts of the business. Maybe you're too inefficient in some aspects of what you're doing. So I'm really glad to hear that from a CFO, that 10% number. And I'd also like to pick up on the point you made, Rob, about partnerships. And I totally concur with you. And I think even more so in B2B organizations. I think partnerships and alliances, they really do allow you to tap into existing audiences and distribution networks, and it really can reduce your customer acquisition costs. And I think that is such an important thing there. And I've been in an organization where actually the majority of new business came from distribution channels that were set up, and they're easy to set up. It's go networking, have some friendly conversations with like-minded organizations that share similar target audiences, that share similar values, that have a similar outlook on product, service quality, customer experience, all that kind of good stuff. And I think that mutually beneficial ecosystems are really where you're going to find a lot of long-term growth.
There's a clear correlation, or maybe it's causation. I for a number of years, I ran the Middle East and Africa for a technology firm. And we went in, we had 69 countries, but we had about 25, 28 distributors across that whole region. I went in, and over the period of 2 years, we basically tripled the number of points of presence with dealers and distributors in countries that we worked in. And we took revenue from, I think it was about 25 million to, when I left 3-4 years later, about 120. So we had a 4x increase in revenue from probably less than threefold increase in points of presence than the distribution channel. So there's definitely correlation. You get the number of partnerships in place, you get people on the ground working for your business, whether it's regionally, for instance, in the UK, or whether it's nationally and geographically across a region. There's a strong correlation. And you've got to have points of presence, you've got to have distribution. And one of the best ways to do that quickly is partnerships and strategic alliances.
I think there's another channel that gets a lot of noise in the business landscape, and that's social media, and particularly in organizations. LinkedIn, TikTok. You often hear a business leader, a CEO, sometimes a CFO saying, "Right, we need to be doing more on social media," and quite often that's a result of we're not doing anything on social media at the moment, or we don't have enough employee advocacy to use it in the right way. And I think certainly my experience, a lot of companies, they will try to blame social media for not delivering revenue growth. And I think a lot of companies that think that way, they're not using social media in the right way. Just doing a post here and a post there at random times of the day is not really going to cut the mustard. But I think if you can leverage social media in the right way to build relationships, foster brand advocacy, and amplify customer success stories, that's when you're going to start winning. And I think if you can turn your employees into advocates to extend that reach, you're going to increase trust, you're going to boost awareness, you're going to enhance your credibility. So many companies use social media in the wrong way. It can be a brilliant tool when used effectively. But Rob, I know you're very prominent on LinkedIn. You've got a huge following. You're everywhere. How are you using social media as a CFO to really build, I guess, your profile and also what you do?
So two things. I mean, social media is low cost, but it's high creation of brand recognition. So I use it an awful lot. I'm probably the most visible CFO in the country right now because it does generate inbound inquiries and it's relatively low cost, but it's branding equally. And you're absolutely right about creating brand ambassadors for a firm. There's some great examples, and I use US examples a lot because I spent a lot of time there. And one of the best ones I found is Chipotle Mexican Grill. Basically, every one of their associates are brand advocates. And I just don't understand why UK-based companies don't do that. There should be an incentive, almost a competitive desire within members of organizations to create a brand, to create recognition. And, celebrating going to a conference, that sort of thing is of no value to me. But celebrating the success of clients, client engagement, wins, there's so much you can do. And I post, for example, every day. And I think there's a growing recognition that CEOs clearly need to be brand advocates, but equally any member of any organization could be a brand advocate and could create a following and of tens of thousands of people. And it definitely has an impact on the generation of inbound inquiries. It's a gift that just keeps on giving. And I struggle why people don't use it more because it is low cost and it's easily available. And to your earlier point, it's about relationships. And if you don't have those relationships, whether it's strategic partnerships, uh, um, contacts in other industries, contacts in other companies where collaborations are possible, if you're not building relationships, your business just won't grow. Um, but the more relationships you have, the more inbound inquiries you'll get, and the more your business will grow. Quite oftentimes now, I'll have 2 to 3 inquiries a day that I'll spend the rest of the week trying to set up. And it's all through engagement and it's all through conversations and it's all through building relationships. And that's what business is. It's about relationships where you can help me and I can help your business. And the sooner and the quicker you get on board with that, and it's relatively low cost. I don't need to invest 10% of my revenue to generate those inquiries. It's relatively low cost, we should all be doing a lot more. And I try my best, Paul. I
No,
try
yeah.
my best.
Well, you're doing a very good job. I don't know any CFOs that are as high profile as you on LinkedIn. So keep up the great work. You're certainly a role model, and I certainly use your profile as kind of a benchmark really for other clients that I work with to say, here is a CFO using LinkedIn in the right way. This is the impact they're making on their personal brands, but also their expertise as a thought leader
It's
in
it's
everything you do.
it's funny. I know an agency business owner that uses my profile in his training classes, and I was like, well, how did that happen? And someone who attended their training class messaged me and said, this guy's using your profile in his training class. I'm thinking, that's weird.
I would like to divert the conversation to how you can drive retention to build long-term value. And we both know that retention is the key to profitability, especially from an investor's perspective, where they want to shift their focus from rapid growth to sustainable value creation. I'd like to explore why high retention rates are critical and why marketing leaders need to have this very focused on their mind, and how to measure customer lifetime value and what marketing can do to reduce churn, because I know that would be music to your ears, reducing churn. So Rob, from your standpoint, how do you evaluate the financial impact of customer retention initiatives that may come from marketing? And what advice do you have for CMOs that are looking to secure investment marketing budget for retention-focused marketing activities?
So a couple of elements here. I worked with a client a couple of years ago that that was growing very rapidly. It was an early stage. They were running for Series A. They were churning over about 30% of their clients were moving on within 12 months. So it's just a rapidly evolving situation. You've got to bring a significant number of inbound new inquiries and qualify them, convert them to replace the clients you're losing. That's not a winning strategy. So one of the first things we had to do in the space of about 6 months is to drive retention rates from under 50% to sort of north of 60, 70%. And I look at, again, a lot of businesses in the US, and a lot of those businesses create value through retention. So they aim to retain 95% of their business on an ongoing yearly basis. And this is the basis of a lot of companies, whether they're healthcare providers or insurance companies. They expect 95% of their customers to be retained and retained at a higher pricing. So, your insurance premium will go up every year. Your healthcare premium will go up every year. And lo and behold, the value that's created in those businesses increases every year. So it's absolutely critical that you look at retention rates. And again, if you've got 50% retention rates, 60% retention rates, clients, that's not a winning strategy. So again, getting your retention rate up to 80%, 85 to 90% is absolutely critical, because again, then you know that you're retaining clients because they're getting a good service, that they're valuing the outcome, and they're willing to pay. And oftentimes, a lot of businesses are reluctant to pass on pricing or to take pricing. In this environment, I'm a huge advocate, and I promote this frequently, is you need to be taking pricing here in the UK on your services. So you need to be putting through 2 or 3 pricing increases per year, certainly every 15 to 18 months. And again, it's something that is much better understood in the US. For example, Chipotle, the example I gave earlier, they put in, I think, 4 or 5 price increases last year and really didn't lose any clients. And one of the mantras I talk to my clients about is, quite often, if you're taking pricing and you're trying to drive up retention rates, you will lose some clients along the way. But the likelihood is those clients you may lose along the way are high maintenance clients, clients that are perhaps lower pricing, likely lower margin. And this goes to ensuring that you understand the margin or the profitability of every client or every product you've got in your portfolio. Most businesses do not have a clue as to their profitability per client or per product. It's just not something they do. I work with a surveying client, and they've got 4 divisions. And really, it's only in the last 6 months that we've got a handle on the profitability of each one of those businesses. And we know that one business is not profitable, 2 businesses are barely breaking even, and one business of the 4 is basically carrying the whole organization. And it's basically because their retention rates are very high. They're on framework agreements, and they basically get a job every 3 to 6 months, and they're very profitable jobs. But you have to understand the pricing and your margin and profitability by client, and understand what retention rates you need. And maybe it'll be you only need 70 to 80% retention rates if you can take pricing frequently, in the example, 2 or 3 times a year. Most businesses can't do that, but you should be taking pricing at least once a year on a regular basis, low single digits, communicating that with your client. That will hopefully look to expand margins over time and create value over time. And as long as you're not bleeding clients and you're working hard to retain clients, whether that's through looking at the lifetime. I'd rather have a client that is on board for 6 years than a client that I can, work with for 6 months at a high retainer. I want to work with them for 4, 5, 6 years. That's where they'll get the value out of me, and equally, I will get the lifetime value out of them. And you have to think long term here.
Earlier in this episode, we spoke about, one of the rules of thumbs are you invest 10% of revenue on marketing. I think the other rule of thumb is that acquiring a new customer costs between 5 and 7 times more than retaining an existing one. So I think if you're looking at your marketing, your BD activities, really focus on those customer acquisition costs and think about what you can do more to retain your existing customers. That demonstrates that you've got a strong value proposition, probably, because they don't want to switch to someone else. They're probably pretty satisfied with what they're receiving. Yes, you can probably do better. Customers are pretty fickle. They always want more. But as long as you build more into your product innovation or service innovation strategy, you can provide that. And I think you're right. Having customers over a longer term, that gives you your predictable revenue streams. You can plan over a longer term. You can, look at your profitability and invest. And I think certainly the investors that I speak to, they certainly regard high retention as a sign of strong product market fit and operational efficiency as well.
You're right. Investors are very focused in on growth. New clients coming on board, they want to see a wait list if you're pre-revenue. They want to see an increasing number of client engagements, and they're very focused on growth. But equally, on the back end, they're very focused on how long are you holding on to that customer? Is it a year and then the client's gone and then you've got to find another client? Or are those clients staying with you, and are they sticky in that they are not going to walk away from you and look for a lower cost alternative? Are they sticky in that you can apply and take some pricing on that as well? They are and to be honest, I think the shift there's a shift that's happened from growth at all costs to, okay, how sticky is the client? How much pricing can we take? What margin expansion and what profitability can we generate over a longer period of time now? And I think, go back 3 to 5 years and it was about growth. The last 2 years or so, it's really about retaining clients, expanding margins, expanding profitability, and holding on to your clients longer such that you're driving up retention rates. And investors are very much focused on that now. Yes, growth, but also retention.
Yeah. And I think that's where marketing leaders need to ensure that the CFO is a strong ally in working together and saying, how can we make sure we can reduce our churn rate of our customer base? And I think retention, it doesn't happen by accident. It requires ongoing communication with your customers. It requires personalized experiences. It requires proactive problem solving as well. If you can kind of think ahead for your customers, what problems might they have later on in the future, and what products or services can we offer that might mitigate that? Again, you're just going to keep them for much longer. But I think there's also businesses have to regularly gather that customer feedback. What are we doing well? What are those churn indicators? How can we address pain points better before the customer leads to a cancellation or switch to a competitor? I think it's really important. And I think that's really where marketers need to kind of step up, particularly with working with the CFO, is to make sure they've got those kind of activities on their marketing strategy rather than tactical, short-term tactical activities just to satisfy, a CEO's ego on getting a piece of PR out there.
I think, again, that client listening is something that is often forgotten. To be honest, the professional services world, they do it really quite well. and they'll go out and talk to clients and understand what they're thinking, where they think things are going. Again, it's investment. It's investment in the brand. A client listening program does not cost a lot of money. You do it once or twice a year kind of thing, and that's fine. It's relatively seamless, if you will. Again, more businesses outside the professional services world should invest in it because it is relatively low cost and it will drive retention rates. It will drive an improvement in retention rates. You're absolutely right.
That's probably a good point to close the show. I think there's a profound statement there, Rob, so thank you. So if you've been listening or watching this episode, I hope you found value from our discussion. In the next episode, Rob joins me again, and we're going to be discussing how to leverage data to make informed marketing decisions. So stay tuned for that one. So Rob, just like to say thank you again for giving up your time today and sharing your perspectives. I really enjoyed the show, and I look forward to the next episode.
Let's see you again, Paul. Cheers.